There is a Roman soldier whose name the official histories never recorded, but whose fate was fixed forever between the hammer, the nails, and the wood of a cross on a hill outside Jerusalem. On a Friday that would change eternity itself. He was not a general. He was not a famous tribune. He was a man of the ranks, a legionary of flesh and blood, who woke up that morning and received an order like any other military order. Escort 3 condemned men to the place called Golgotha and carry out the sentence. What no commander told him, because no commander knew it, was that on that day he was not executing a criminal. On that day he was standing at the exact center of the most important event in the history of the universe, and what happened to him afterward would depend entirely on what his heart was able to see when heaven finally answered. This is the story of that soldier, and it is one of the most extraordinary and least told stories the early Christian world ever preserved. But before we talk about the soldier, we have to understand the world he lived in, because that world explains everything. The Roman Empire of the 1st century was the most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever produced. Its legions had crossed deserts, scaled mountains, and subdued peoples from dozens of different cultures. A Roman legionary was not simply a man with a sword. He was the product of years of brutal training, of an iron hierarchy, of a loyalty to Caesar that was carved into his identity before anything else. For a man like him, killing was not an anomaly. Killing was his trade, and crucifixion, in particular, was not just an execution. It was a tool of the empire, engineered to end a life in a way so visible, so slow, and so degrading that no one who saw it could ever forget the price of defying Rome. It was reserved for the worst, rebellious slaves, political agitators, the men Rome wanted not merely to remove, but to humiliate in public. It did not happen in secret. It happened beside the busiest roads, in full view, so that everyone entering and leaving a city would have to look at it. The soldiers who administered it did so with professional efficiency. They had watched dozens of men die this way. To them, Golgotha was work. It was a shift. It was a Friday. And yet, something different happened that Friday. Something the soldiers who stood there could not fully explain, and could not fully ignore either. When you read the record, the 4 Gospels left us slowly with attention. A series of details emerges about what those men experienced on that hill. Details that go far beyond the simple carrying out of an order, and what happened afterward, in the decades that followed, to at least one of those men, is a story almost no one tells. To understand it, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the dawn of that Friday, when it all began. The night before had been long and strange in Jerusalem. The city was overflowing with pilgrims who had come to celebrate Passover, the most important feast on the Jewish calendar, the memorial of the Exodus from Egypt, of the liberation God had worked through Moses. The narrow streets smelled of roasted lamb and unleavened bread. Families crowded into rented upper rooms, and the whole city, packed far beyond its normal size, carried a strange electricity in the air, the way a place does right before something breaks. But inside the governor's residence, Pontius Pilate had spent a restless night. During the morning trial, his wife had sent him a message he did not expect, a warning. "Have nothing to do with that righteous man," she said, "for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him. That single line is preserved in Matthew 27-19. Pilate was a pragmatic politician, not a superstitious man by nature. But that message unsettled him. He tried to release Jesus more than once. He offered the crowd the chance to free one prisoner in honor of the feast. And the crowd chose Barabbas. He had Jesus scourged, perhaps hoping that would satisfy the accuser's appetite for blood. It did not. And in the end he washed his hands in front of everyone, a symbolic gesture of detachment, and handed Jesus over to his soldiers. It was those soldiers who took Jesus after the trial and led him into the praetorium, the Roman headquarters inside the city. What happened there is told by Matthew, Mark, and John, and it reveals something about the nature of the men who were about to run this execution. The whole cohort, which could be as many as 600 men, though the number gathered for the occasion was probably smaller, surrounded him. They threw a scarlet robe over his shoulders, a mockery of royalty. They twisted together a crown out of thorn branches and pressed it onto his head. They put a reed in his right hand as a fake scepter, and they knelt in front of him in mockery, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." Matthew 27:28-29 records it. It was a spectacle designed to humiliate, a military parody of a coronation, the way men trained to obey Caesar expressed their contempt for anyone else who claimed real authority. But there is a sacred irony in that scene the soldiers could not see. They were kneeling, even in mockery, before the one being before whom every knee will one day genuinely bow. As Paul would later write in Philippians 2:10, "At the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth." They were rehearsing worship. They thought they were making a joke. After the mockery in the praetorium, the soldiers led Jesus out toward Golgotha. Roman custom demanded that the condemned man carry the horizontal beam of his own cross, the patibulum, across his shoulders. Jesus tried, but the weight, combined with the state they had already left his body in, made his progress too slow for soldiers who had an execution to carry out on a schedule they could not stretch indefinitely. So they made a decision that would mark forever the name of a man who happened to be passing by. They seized a man named Simon from the city of Cyrene in North Africa, who was coming in from the fields, and they forced him to carry the cross of Jesus. Mark 15:21 even tells us that Simon was the father of Alexander and Rufus, names Mark records because, by the time he wrote his gospel, those men were known inside the Christian community. Think about that for a moment. A chance encounter that began with the shove of a Roman soldier's order transformed the life of an entire family. The soldiers thought they were solving a logistics problem. They were writing a man into the story of God forever. When they reached Golgotha, which in Aramaic means the place of the skull, and which the Latin text would call Calvary, they got to work. They offered Jesus wine mixed with myrrh, a mild painkiller, a practice attested in the ancient sources and mentioned in Mark 15:23. He tasted it, but would not drink it, and then the soldiers proceeded with the crucifixion itself. What followed, during the hours Jesus hung on the cross, was watched by the soldiers with that mixture of professional indifference and practical attention that defined Roman executioners. They had to make sure the sentence was carried out, but they also had time on their hands while they waited, and they filled that time with what soldiers do when they wait. They played dice. John 19:23-24 records that they divided his clothes into 4 parts, one for each soldier, but that the tunic, seamless, woven in one piece, they did not want to tear. So they cast lots for it to see who would keep it. And John adds that this fulfilled what Psalm 22:18 had written centuries before. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Sit with that. 4 soldiers, gambling at the foot of a cross, were fulfilling, without the slightest idea, a prophecy written 1,000 years earlier. Their boredom was scripture. Their dice were prophecy. While that was happening, 3 groups of people stood on Golgotha. There were the priests and scribes who had driven the condemnation, who kept mocking. There was the crowd of curious onlookers and Passover pilgrims, and there was the small cluster of people who loved him. His mother Mary, the other Mary, Mary Magdalene, and the disciple John, the only one of the 12 who had not fled. They stood close in silence, bearing the unbearable. And the soldiers stood between those 2 worlds, in the physical center of the scene, doing their job. That is when the things the soldiers had not planned for began to happen. From the cross, Jesus spoke. He did not scream curses, the way crucified men sometimes did. He did not beg for mercy. His first recorded words in Luke 23:34 were a prayer. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And the object of that forgiveness included everyone standing there, which meant it included the soldiers. A man nailed to a cross, asking forgiveness for the men who nailed him there, was something no Roman military manual had ever anticipated, and none could explain. The soldiers who heard those words heard them. They could not hear them. The only question was what they would do with what they heard. The hours that followed brought more words from the cross. They brought the exchange between Jesus and the 2 men crucified beside him, one of whom recognized in that moment who Jesus was, and received the promise of paradise that very day, according to Luke 23:43. They brought the moment when Jesus entrusted his mother to the care of the disciple John, a gesture of tenderness that fit no pattern of behavior the soldiers had ever seen in a condemned man. And then, around midday, something happened that had not been on any execution order handed to them that morning. The sky went dark. Matthew 27:45 records it precisely. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness over all the land. That corresponds to the period between noon and 3 in the afternoon. It was not a solar eclipse. It could not have been. Passover always fell at the full moon, and solar eclipses are impossible during a full moon. This was something the Roman soldiers, with all their pragmatism, could not file under any category their experience had ever given them. The sun disappeared for 3 hours in the middle of the day, and they were standing beneath that darkened sky, guarding a cross, while the world behaved in ways no one had authorized. Then, near 3 o'clock, Jesus spoke again, this time with a cry of anguish that Matthew 27:46 preserves in the very Aramaic words he used. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? It is the opening line of Psalm 22, the very same psalm about dividing garments and casting lots, the same psalm that describes, with staggering exactness, the experience of crucifixion, written by David centuries before crucifixion existed as a method of execution. Some of those standing there misheard and thought he was calling for Elijah And one of them, whom some interpreters identify as a soldier or someone associated with them, took a sponge, soaked it in sour wine, put it on a reed, and lifted it to Jesus' lips. John 19:28 records that Jesus had said, "I thirst," and that this too fulfilled the scripture. It was his last act of receiving anything from this world before he died. After he drank, Jesus spoke the words John 19:30 records, "It is finished." And Matthew and Luke add that he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And he breathed his last. And in that moment, according to Matthew 27:51-53, a series of simultaneous events transformed the atmosphere on Golgotha completely. The veil of the temple was torn from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, the tombs were opened. It was as if all of creation answered what had just happened with the heartbeat of its creator. And the soldiers were standing there, in the center of all of it, unable to ignore a single thing. And that is when one of the most important moments in the entire account of the Passion took place. A moment that often slips by unnoticed, because it comes right after all the drama of the death itself. Matthew 27:54 records it. When the centurion and those with him, who were guarding Jesus, saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and said, "Truly this was the Son of God." And Luke 23:47 adds another line from that same centurion. Seeing what had happened, he glorified God and said, "Truly this man was righteous." A Roman officer, trained in the polytheism of the empire, standing at the site of the execution he had just supervised, looking at what heaven had just done, spoke a confession of faith. Not an elaborate faith, not a complete theology, but the recognition of something no military training had ever taught him to say. This man was the Son of God. That centurion is the heart of everything that follows, because he is the man that Christian tradition, both the tradition preserved in written sources and the one carried orally in the earliest communities, associated with the name history, would remember, Longinus. Now that name does not appear in the canonical Gospels. The four evangelists refer to him simply as the centurion. But his figure was so significant to the early Christian communities that the name tradition gave him began to appear in texts of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and it settled into the collection of Passion traditions that the ancient Christian world passed down with remarkable consistency across the centuries. The name Longinus derives, according to most of the philological interpretations, from the Greek word lonch, which means spear or lance. And it is precisely because of his connection to a lance that this soldier occupies a place unlike any other in the account of the Passion. Because after Jesus died, something happened that John 19:31-37 narrates, with a precision that only makes sense if the author was standing there and saw what he describes. The Jewish authorities, aware that the Passover Sabbath began that day at sunset, asked Pilate to hasten the death of the crucified men so they could be taken down before nightfall. The Roman way of doing this was to break the legs, which prevented the crucified man from pushing himself up to breathe, accelerating suffocation. So the soldiers went and broke the legs of the two men crucified beside Jesus. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, John records, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And then John says something extraordinary. He who saw it has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you also may believe. John knows that what he is describing is hard to believe, and he insists, twice, on the truthfulness of his testimony. That soldier, the one who pierced Jesus' side with a lance, is the man tradition identifies as Longinus. And the same tradition adds a medical detail that, if it is historical, explains a great deal about what followed in his life. That Longinus suffered from a disease of the eyes that gravely damaged his sight. When the lance opened Jesus' side and the blood and water fell, some of that fluid touched the soldier's eyes, and his vision was restored in that instant. Now, it is important to be honest here. That specific detail appears in the apocryphal Passion writings, in the Gospel of Nicodemus, and in other sources of early Christianity. It is not in the canonical Gospels. Whatever weight each believer chooses to give that particular tradition, what the canonical texts do establish clearly is this. This soldier saw what he saw, and what he saw transformed him. Because what happened after the crucifixion was not that the soldiers went back to their barracks and carried on with their lives as if nothing had occurred. The Gospels give us hints that things were not that simple. Matthew 28:4 tells us that when the women arrived at the tomb on Sunday morning, and the angel rolled back the stone, the guards who had been posted there to keep watch trembled with fear and became like dead men. These were men whose entire job was precisely not to lose their composure in the face of adversity, and they were paralyzed by what they witnessed. When they recovered, they went to the priests to report what had happened. And the priests gave them money and told them to say that the disciples had stolen the body while they slept. Matthew 28:11-15 records that transaction with remarkable frankness, and adds that this story has been spread among the Jews to this day, which suggests that when Matthew wrote, there were still people circulating that version. The soldiers took the money and obeyed. But the question the text does not answer, the question history does try to answer, is this. What happened in the hearts of those men when they were left alone with what they had seen? And here is where we want to ask you something. You who are listening to this right now, have you ever thought about what you would do if you could speak with someone who was actually on Golgotha that day? What would you ask a man who saw with his own eyes what happened when Jesus died and heaven answered? What one question would you want him to look you in the eye and answer? Tell us in the comments. Your answer might be exactly what stops someone else scrolling through the comments today and makes them think about all of this for the first time. These conversations between people who are wrestling with the same story are part of why this channel exists. Now, let's follow the soldier the rest of the way, because his story is only beginning. For the centurion who had confessed, "Truly this man was the Son of God," the answer that Christian tradition preserved is the most extraordinary of all. According to the sources the early church received and passed down, Longinus could not return to his old life. What he had seen on Golgotha, and what he experienced at the tomb, if we accept the tradition that places him there too, had broken something inside him that had no name in the Roman military vocabulary. And he was not the only one. Tradition speaks of at least 2 other soldiers who went with Longinus into what came next. Men who had stood on that hill and could not shake off what they had witnessed. What they did was leave the army. They abandoned the legion. They renounced their military careers, the economic security that Roman service guaranteed, the identity that for years had been the only one they knew. And they went looking for the disciples of Jesus. Tradition records that Longinus was instructed in the faith by the apostles, that he was baptized, and that he returned to his homeland in Cappadocia, the region that today corresponds to central Turkey. There he began to live and to proclaim what he had seen, not as an orator in the public squares, but first as personal testimony, as a man who could say, with an authority no one else had, "I was there. I watched him die. I saw what heaven did when he died. So what I'm telling you is not a story someone told me. It's what my own eyes saw." And in Cappadocia, Longinus found that his testimony produced conversions. People who heard the story firsthand, from one of the soldiers who had actually stood on Golgotha, responded differently than they did when they heard it second-hand. There was something in the authority of the direct witness that could not be replicated, and Longinus knew it. He knew that what he had seen that Friday was not just his personal story. It was the story on which the salvation of every human being who had ever lived or ever would live depended. And that awareness filled him not with pride, but with urgency. Longinus's life in Cappadocia was not comfortable. The Roman Empire was a closed, watchful system, and a soldier who deserted, and who then began preaching the divinity of a man the empire had executed as a criminal, did not go unnoticed. The local authorities came under pressure to do something about the man who was disturbing the order with his stories about a dead man who had risen. Persecution came, as it came to almost every early witness of the gospel who refused to stay silent. But what tradition records is that Longinus did not run. He did not change his story. He did not trade his testimony for safety. He had seen too much to lie, and what he had seen was too important to keep quiet. The martyrdom of Longinus is documented in the Menologion of Basil II, a collection of the lives of the saints compiled in the 10th century under the patronage of the Byzantine Emperor Basil II, drawing on much older traditions. It also appears in the Synaxarion of Constantinople and in various hagiographic collections of the Eastern Christian world. According to these sources, Longinus was executed in Cappadocia for his faith. Both the Catholic and the Orthodox churches recognize him as a saint, which tells us that the tradition of his conversion and martyrdom was received with enough credibility to be preserved officially in the largest branches of historical Christianity. Said as directly as possible, here is what that means. The man who pierced the side of Jesus with a lance, the man who stood on Golgotha that Friday, died as a martyr for the very faith he had unknowingly helped bring into being by carrying out his order of execution. He crossed over from the side of the man who took a life to the side of the men who gave their own for that same life. He went from the hammer and the nails to the crown Paul describes in 2 Timothy 4:8, the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award on that day to all who have loved his appearing. It is one of the most complete reversals the grace of God has ever produced in the story of any human being. And he was not the only soldier of the crucifixion whose story tradition preserved. The early church also spoke of Stephaton, the soldier who offered the sponge of sour wine to Jesus on the cross. His name appears in the Gospel of Peter, a 2nd century apocryphal text that, while it carries no canonical authority, reflects traditions that circulated in the earliest Christian communities. His story is less developed than Longinus's, but his presence in the record shows that the first generations of believers were deeply interested in who had been on Golgotha and what had become of them. To understand fully what these men lived through, we have to understand what crucifixion meant within the cultural and religious framework of first-century Jerusalem, and not only within the Roman one. For the Jews, crucifixion carried an additional meaning that made it particularly painful from a spiritual point of view. Deuteronomy 21:23 declared that anyone who is hung on a tree is under God's curse. For the religious authorities who had driven the condemnation of Jesus, that was part of the calculation. A crucified Messiah was, from the perspective of the law, a Messiah rejected by God himself. That is what they wanted to prove. What they did not anticipate was that Paul, the former Pharisee who came later, would take exactly that verse and turn it into the very heart of the theology of redemption. In Galatians 3:13, Paul writes that Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, "Cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree." Jesus did not simply die on a cross. He carried on himself the entire curse that human sin deserved, so that those who believed in him wouldn't have to carry it. And the soldiers who carried out that sentence were, without knowing it, the instruments of the greatest transaction of grace in the cosmos. That is also why the centurion's reaction was not merely an emotional response to the spectacle of the earthquake and the darkness. When he said, "Truly this man was the Son of God," he was saying something theologically explosive. He was dismantling, with a single sentence, the entire narrative the religious authorities had constructed. If he was the Son of God, then the curse of the tree had not fallen on him. It was the reverse. He had deliberately absorbed it, to neutralize it. He was the Lamb of God, as John the Baptist had said in John 1:29, who takes away the sin of the world. The centurion did not know all of that theology, but his heart, in that moment, recognized the fundamental truth that all of that theology describes, and that recognition was enough to begin. Longinus's story is not only the story of one individual. It is a story that illuminates something about the very nature of the grace the New Testament proclaims. Because in the Gospels, the first people to recognize Jesus as the Son of God were not always the ones you would expect. It was not the high priests, who had the most direct access to the Scriptures and the most elaborate theological training. It was not the scribes and Pharisees, who studied the law with a dedication others admired. It was the Magi from the East, guided by a star. It was old Simeon in the temple, who recognized him when he was a 40-day-old infant. It was John the Baptist at the Jordan. It was Nathanael, an unpretentious man, astonished that Jesus had seen him under a fig tree. And it was a Roman centurion on Golgotha, formed in a completely different tradition, who looked at what heaven had just done and spoke the most important truth that can be spoken about any human being who has ever lived. This is not the only time the New Testament puts a Roman officer at the center of the scene. Luke tells us in chapter 7 of his Gospel about another encounter Jesus had with a centurion, a different one from the man at Golgotha, in the town of Capernaum, whose servant was sick. This centurion sent word that Jesus need not even enter his house, because he did not feel worthy. Let him simply say the word, and the servant would be healed. And Jesus was amazed, and said in Luke 7:9, "Something extraordinary. I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such great faith. A Roman soldier, a representative of the imperial power occupying the promised land, had the faith that Israel itself was failing to show. That pattern repeats at Golgotha with the centurion of the crucifixion, and both stories together point to something the New Testament says explicitly in many other ways, that the grace of God does not respect the boundaries human beings draw between themselves, whether ethnic, cultural, professional, or historical. The conversion of Cornelius in Acts 10 is the third great centurion moment of the New Testament, and it is the most elaborate of the three. Cornelius was a Roman officer stationed in Caesarea Maritima, described as devout and God-fearing, along with his whole household, generous to the poor, and constant in prayer. An angel appeared to him and told him that his prayers had risen as a memorial before God, and that he should send for Simon Peter. Peter went, even though entering the house of a Gentile was something a devout Jew would normally never do. And in that house, while Peter was still preaching, the Holy Spirit fell on everyone present, before Peter had even finished speaking, before they were even baptized. The opening of the gospel to the Gentiles, the moment that changed the direction of the Christian movement from a Jewish sect into a universal faith, happened in the house of a Roman centurion. Again and again, when the New Testament wants to show that the grace of God reaches farther than any human system would expect, it puts a Roman officer at the center of the scene. That is not an accident. It is the God of the Bible showing exactly who he is, the one who searches in the places where no one looks, who calls the ones no one would call, who transforms precisely those the world has written off as impossible to transform. The soldier who drove the nails, the man who opened the side with the lance, the guard who watched the tomb. None of them was on anyone's list of candidates to become the first witnesses of the resurrection or the first to confess the divinity of Christ. And yet, there they were, there they stood, and some of them answered in the only way a person can answer when heaven opens over you in the least expected place. There is also a prophetic dimension to this story that deserves attention. The prophet Zechariah, writing 5 centuries before the crucifixion, recorded in Zechariah 12:10 a promise of God about the future of Israel. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. The verb pierce in that Hebrew text is dakar, which indicates a wound made with a sharp object. And John 19:37 explicitly cites that verse as fulfilled. In the moment the soldier opened Jesus' side with the lance. Revelation 1.7 cites it again in the context of the return of Christ. Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. In biblical theology, the soldier who pierced Jesus is not merely a historical figure from the past. He is named in the prophecy of the Lord's return. His action was recorded in eternity in a way that neither he nor any of his companions could have imagined in that moment. The lance itself has a history that continues past Golgotha. The relic that Christian tradition calls the Holy Lance, the one attributed to the soldier Longinus, is one of the most mentioned and most debated objects in Christian religious archaeology. Several objects have claimed to be that lance, or parts of it, at different points in history. One in the Vatican, one in Vienna, one in Krakow, one that was carried to Antioch during the First Crusade, and that lifted the spirits of the Crusaders at a critical moment of the siege. The history of these objects, whatever their archaeological authenticity, reflects something profound. Christian humanity did not want to forget the man who stood on the other side of that lance, nor the soldier who held it. Both mattered. Both matter. In the Christian art of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the figure of Longinus found expression in the great cycles of sacred art, in crucifixes, in altarpieces, in the stained glass of cathedrals, often showing the soldier with the lance on the right-hand side of the cross. That position, the right side, was interpreted symbolically by medieval artists and theologians as the side of mercy, the side of the good thief, the side of those who recognized Christ at the decisive moment. Placing Longinus on the right was not an accidental detail. It was a theological statement. This man, who opened the side of Christ with a lance, was reached by the mercy that flowed from that wound. Dante even places Longinus among the blessed in the Paradiso of his Divine Comedy. For his 14th century readers, the story of the soldier who passed from the lance to martyrdom was part of the common spiritual vocabulary of Christendom, as familiar as the stories of Peter or Paul or any other figure of the apostolic age. And Longinus was only the first in a long line. As the 2nd and 3rd centuries advanced, the number of Roman soldiers who converted to Christianity kept growing, despite the persecution. The records of martyrdom from that period include a significant number of Roman soldiers executed precisely for refusing to take part in the imperial rituals the Christian faith rejected. Saint Maurice and the Theban Legion, dated to the 3rd century, is the most famous example. An entire military unit massacred because its soldiers, largely of Egyptian and Christian origin, refused to obey an order that contradicted their faith. In that long line of soldier martyrs, Longinus holds the place of the pioneer, the first in a series that would continue for centuries. The early church of the 1st centuries actually faced a question that Longinus's story helped answer in practical terms. How should it receive the Roman soldiers who wanted to convert? It was a complicated question, because the soldiers served an empire that persecuted Christians, and because their work included acts that Christian ethics called into question. Tertullian, the Christian writer of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, addressed this tension in several of his writings. Some parts of the early church adopted very strict positions on the incompatibility of military service with the faith. Others took more nuanced positions, distinguishing between the specific acts a soldier was or was not called to perform. But what no part of the early church denied was that soldiers could be saved, that grace could reach them, and that the story of the centurion of Golgotha was one of the clearest proofs of it. The man with the lance had become the argument that settled the matter. There is also a dimension of this story that connects directly to the Gospel of John and to the sacramental theology that Gospel develops. John is the only one of the 4 evangelists who narrates the episode of the lance. And John, who was present at Golgotha according to his own testimony, gives particular weight to the 2 elements that flowed from the side of Jesus: blood and water. In John's theology, the water is a symbol of the Spirit and of baptism, and the blood is a symbol of the redeeming sacrifice and of the Eucharist. The opened side of Christ is, in that reading, the origin of the sacramental life of the Church, the wound from which the life of the whole believing community was born. and the first person to receive those elements directly, if the tradition about the healing of Longinus's eyes has any historical basis, was the soldier who made them flow. There is a spiritual logic in that which Christian theology has recognized across the centuries. The one who wounded the lamb was the first to be reached by what flowed from the wound. It is grace operating with that kind of paradoxical precision that is its most recognizable signature. The figure of Longinus also echoes the prophecy of Isaiah about the suffering servant. Isaiah 53 is one of the Old Testament texts the New Testament cites most often in connection with the Passion of Christ. Isaiah 53:5 says, "But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." The word wounds in that verse evokes precisely the kind of injury a lance produces. When Longinus opened the side of Jesus with his weapon, he was, without knowing it, the physical instrument fulfilling a prophecy written 600 years earlier. And the healing that wound produced, according to Isaiah, was not only for Israel, it was for us, for all who would recognize in the suffering servant the Lamb who carried the weight of the world. Longinus entered that us in the most direct way possible, not through years of studying the prophetic scrolls, but through a single moment of recognition in which his heart saw what his eyes had not been able to see while he carried out the order. Archaeology and ancient history let us understand the physical context of everything these men lived through. Cappadocia, the region tradition says Longinus returned to in order to live and proclaim his faith, was a Roman province in the heart of Anatolia, the region that is today central Turkey. It was a land of extraordinary landscapes, of deep valleys and rock formations that look like they belong to another world, where the first Christian communities found in the caves both physical refuge and spiritual expression. The rock-cut churches of Cappadocia, some of them carved directly into the volcanic stone and decorated with frescoes of astonishing beauty, are the visual testimony that this territory was one of the earliest and most fertile centers of primitive Christianity. The Apostle Peter, in his first letter, greets the exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, which confirms that there were established Christian communities in Cappadocia in the first decades after the resurrection. If Longinus returned there and began to proclaim his faith, he did so in a territory the apostolic preaching had also reached, where the two streams of testimony could have reinforced one another. The city of Caesarea of Cappadocia, which today is called Kayseri, is the capital of the province, and it is the place tradition associates most directly with the life and martyrdom of Longinus. In that city, for centuries, there stood a church dedicated to his memory. Even though the original structure has not survived in its primitive form, the very existence of that place of worship is an indicator that the Christian community of Cappadocia counted Longinus among its spiritual founders, one of the men through whose testimony the faith had come to that land. And the geographic closeness between Cappadocia and Jerusalem, connected by the commercial and military roads of the Roman Empire, made it perfectly possible that a discharged or deserted Roman soldier could have made that journey and built his life there. The monastic communities of Cappadocia, which in the 3rd and 4th centuries would produce some of the most important theologians of Christianity, the so-called Cappadocian Fathers, preserved the tradition about Longinus with the same care with which they preserved other texts and traditions of the apostolic period. Basil the Great one of the most influential of those fathers, knew and respected the tradition about the soldier of the crucifixion. When the Menologian of Basil II later gathered the life of Longinus, it was not inventing something new. It was formalizing something that had been transmitted faithfully for generations. The story of the lance of Longinus, the Holy Lance, has one last turn that deserves mention. One of the objects that claims to be the point of that lance is kept in the imperial treasury in Vienna, in the Kunsthistorisches Museum. That object, known as the Vienna Lance, or the Holy Lance, has a documented history that goes back to at least the 8th century, when it appears mentioned in the chronicles of the Carolingian court. Regardless of whether that specific object has any direct connection to the events of Golgotha, its history illustrates something about the way Christian humanity, across the centuries, has insisted on keeping alive the memory of that soldier, and of what he did. Keeping that object in the most important treasury of the empire was a statement. What happened at Golgotha is not a myth or a legend. It happened. And the instruments of what happened deserve to be remembered. Tradition also records that the relics of Longinus were honored in various places of the ancient Christian world. It is said that his head was sent to Rome, and that it was later moved to different churches in different periods. The relics of the martyrs in the ancient and medieval Christian world were not objects of superstitious worship, but physical signs of a spiritual presence, material reminders that real bodies of real people had been transformed by grace and had sustained that transformation to the very end, even in the face of death. In the Eastern Christian liturgy, the feast of St. Longinus the Centurion is celebrated on the 16th of October, while in the Western tradition and the Roman martyrology, he is assigned the 15th of March. That difference of dates between the two traditions reflects the complexity of how liturgical traditions were transmitted across the centuries. But what both traditions share is the certainty that this man existed, that what history records about him deserves commemoration, and that his story remains relevant to the Christian faith in any age. Every time that feast is observed, anywhere in the world, the Church is remembering that the grace of God could reach the soldier of Golgotha. And if it could reach him, it can reach anyone. There is a line of Paul in 1 Corinthians 1:27-28 that seems written specifically for this story. God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. And the lowly things of this world, and the despised things, and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are. A Roman soldier who carried out orders of crucifixion did not fit into any category that the Jewish world or the Greek world of that time considered a candidate to be a witness of the divinity of Christ. He was exactly the kind of person those cultures would have written off before considering him at all. And yet it was he who spoke the words the priests and the scribes could not speak. It was he who confessed what the religious elite of Jerusalem rejected with all their training and all their institutional authority. And it was he who, according to tradition, paid with his life the price of not taking back what he had seen. The story of the soldiers of the crucifixion also speaks to something the contemporary world needs to hear with particular urgency: the power of first-hand testimony. In an age when information is abundant but trust is scarce, when almost any narrative can be manufactured with enough technology, the testimony of someone who was actually present remains something no algorithm can replicate. Longinus did not have an elaborate philosophical argument. He did not have a systematic theology of what he had witnessed. He had something simpler and more powerful: the memory of what his eyes had seen, of what his ears had heard, of what his body had felt when the ground trembled beneath his feet and the sky went dark over his head. And the man who had just died on that cross had said things that no condemned man ever said. He had that, and with that it was enough to change the direction of his entire life. The first martyrs of Christianity, those who gave their lives rather than take back what they had seen, tell us something fundamental about the nature of their testimony. People do not die for things they know are lies. The willingness to die for something is the deepest proof that a person believes that something is true. And the soldiers who stood on Golgotha, the ones who saw what they saw, and then could not rest until others knew it too, belong to that category of witnesses whose seriousness cannot be dismissed easily. They had nothing to gain by lying about the divinity of a man the empire had executed as a criminal. Everything they had to lose, they lost anyway: their careers, their security, in some cases their freedom and their lives. What they gained, what tradition records they found on the road they chose, was something no Roman military career could offer: the peace Jesus himself had promised in John 14:27, the peace the world cannot give. That is why it is worth pausing on one pattern that runs through this whole story and through the wider New Testament: the pattern of the earthquake that opens the heart. For the centurion of Golgotha, the moment came through the darkening of the sun, the earthquake, the final cry of Jesus, and the experience of the lance. But he was not the only one. In Acts 16, the jailer of Philippi, a man whose entire job was the opposite of grace, whose work was to keep locked up the ones the system did not want set free, was awakened at midnight while Paul and Silas prayed and sang hymns in the prison, and an earthquake shook the foundations, opened every door, and loosened every chain. The jailer panicked, thinking the prisoners had escaped and his life was forfeit. But Paul cried out that everyone was still there. And in that moment, the jailer fell trembling before Paul and Silas and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And they gave him the simplest and most complete answer that can be given: "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." The jailer of Philippi, like the centurion of Golgotha, needed an earthquake for his heart to open. And Saul of Tarsus needed the light on the road to Damascus. The form of the moment varies: a darkened sky, a shaking prison, a blinding light. What does not vary is the disposition of the heart that says yes when the moment comes. God does not force conversion. He does not operate by coercion, but he does operate through the moments of fracture, the moments when the defenses a person has built around their heart come down, because something happens that cannot be explained and cannot be ignored. Longinus said yes, and that yes carried him from Golgotha to Cappadocia, from the lance to martyrdom, from the service of Caesar to citizenship in the kingdom that has no end. But the question Longinus's story leaves open, the question any honest listener carries away from this account, is not only historical, it is personal. Because the same grace that reached the soldier on Golgotha, the same grace that flowed from the open side of Jesus that Friday, is still active today, there is a truth in his story that is deeply comforting for anyone who listens to it with the awareness of something in their own past they cannot undo. Longinus could not undo what he had done. There was no going back, no pulling out the lance, no erasing the hours on Golgotha. What he had done, he had done. But what God did with what Longinus did was turn it into the starting point of a new life, into the sign God used to tell that man, "I see you. You are here. And this is not the end of your story. It is the beginning." That is exactly what the gospel proclaims for every human being who comes to the cross, with the honesty to admit who they are and what they have done. Grace does not operate in spite of our history. Very often it operates precisely through it. Peter says it in Acts 2:39, with a universality that admits no exceptions. "The promise is for you and for your children, and for all who are far off, for all whom the Lord our God will call." No limit of distance, no limit of past, no limit of what you have done or failed to do. The call is as wide as grace, and grace is as wide as the heart of God. The heart that John 3:16 describes in the only way it can be described. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." The story of the end of the soldier who crucified Jesus is not a story of condemnation. It is exactly the opposite. It is the story of a man who reached the lowest point any human being can reach, the point where he was the direct instrument of the death of the Son of God, and who, from that exact point, was lifted by grace to the standing of witness, of believer, of martyr, of saint. It is the most radical story of redemption the apostolic age recorded, more radical even than Paul's, who at least persecuted believers out of a religious conviction he thought was right. Longinus did it as part of an ordinary day's work, with no added theological weight at all. And he was reached anyway. That is what makes his story so powerful and so necessary in any age. It tells us that there is no point so low that the grace of God cannot reach it, that there is no past so dark that the light of Golgotha cannot illuminate it, that there is no soldier, no sinner, no man, no woman, outside the reach of the love that defeated death on a Friday, that looked like the end and turned out to be the beginning of everything. The Roman soldier who stood on Golgotha ended up where no military manual could ever have taken him, in the arms of the very God he had wounded. And that story is still available with the same generosity to every person hearing these words right now. If this account moved something in you, if it made you see the passion of Christ from an angle you hadn't considered before, subscribe to this channel so we can keep walking together through the places and the stories the Bible holds and the world needs to know. And if you know someone who needs to hear today that grace can reach anyone, no matter where they've been or what they've done, share this video with them. It might be exactly the word their heart has been waiting for.